Okay, hello everybody. I am delighted that you're all here, and this is a very special event. My popularity went up temporarily simply because we're holding this event. And that tells you how special Mike is. He's an alum, he's an honorary fellow of the college, he has held and holds records in space, and he's an inspiration to so many. He is probably the most accomplished person I've met. I did a lot of research for this evening, and they tell you that normally you can use 3 words to describe somebody. That covers about 94% of the distribution. Then there's 6% of the distribution that require more than 3 words, either because they're really awful, that's about 4%, or they're really, really special, 2%. Mike is in the 2%. And I struggled.
So do I get 4 words?
You get 5 words plus inspiration that I slipped in there. So you get vision, perseverance, humility, agility, and courage. Any disagreement?
Those have happened sometimes in my life, yes.
Okay, so you were an undergraduate here. You went on to do a PhD in physics. You then joined NASA, but not as an astronaut. At 30, you became one.
Yes.
You spent 375 days in space.
And I didn't count those. In fact, it may be a bit more than that, but it's just, I wasn't doing the thing on the wall, you know.
Okay. But you started dreaming about all this at age 6, I'm told.
Yes.
How did it start?
Mum took me to a museum in the United States. Actually, it wasn't a museum. It was called the World State Fair in a small state, Minnesota, in the United States. And they felt their fair was, you know, the world. And it showed a capsule of John Glenn's trip around the Earth for 3 orbits, which followed Yuri Gagarin's, who was the first. And this thing was in front of us as I was a little boy. And, you know, Mum say, "What do you want to be when you grow up, Michael?" And I was, you know, not very aware. But I knew that my dad was a Royal Air Force pilot, and I knew he made a lot of noise in those jets. So I said, "Well, what does an astronaut do, Mummy?" And she says, "Well, you know, he flies in that little, that capsule that it went around the Earth." And I, you know, had poor appreciation of what I was being asked. And she said, "Well, do you want to fly in that?" And I looked at it, and it was all blackened and burned up. And I just said, "No, Mummy," because it looked like a burned-up dustbin. But above us was a model of a flying vehicle, probably the X-15 or the XL-20. And I said, "Well, I wouldn't mind flying in that one day." And that was what I thought it was more like my father's aircraft, so I said, maybe that. But at that point, Mum gave me books on space, and my grandma, my mother's mother, American, gave me books on space.
And no rockets made out of Legos? No.
No. The Lego rockets didn't come along until much later, but I did make a rocket out of corrugated iron and a bucket on top in the back of our garden. And there was some child's story where you have to dream that it gets transformed into a real rocket.
Okay. Age 16.
It didn't turn out.
So age 16, you decided to learn how to fly, right?
Yes.
How did that go?
So in the boarding schools, and I was a boarding school boy at King's Canterbury, they had a combined cadet force, which in American terms would be a ROTC, or here it's the CCF. And that's where I got the opportunity to fly gliders for the first time for 2 weeks. And I ended up being soloed. I remember, yes. It was a huge moment.
Do you remember the sensation?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. If you have children, and many of you in the audience are too young to have those yet, but it's a huge feeling of responsibility when you're actually able to pilot an aircraft. And being launched on a winch, which is what we were doing in Mansfield down in Kent, was an incredible feeling of accomplishment, because I was a 15-year-old, couldn't drive, but was able to fly. Yeah.
And did you connect the dots that this is step one?
I had that in my mind at the age of 15, that the flying gliders with the CCF would help me be selected by the Royal Air Force, because that was my obvious go-to. It may not be obvious to you, but because all astronauts up to that point had been test pilots, I thought that to do that, to become an astronaut, I had to be a pilot. And I thought maybe, obviously, the UK would have a space program by the time I went to university that was selecting astronauts. It didn't. But that was my naive hope at that age. And so I felt joining the Royal Air Force afterwards at 16 would be the key. That failed because I failed an eyesight test.
How devastating was that?
It was devastating. I don't know. Being lucky in having a goal was great, but having your goals dashed is not so great. And when I was told by the Royal Air Force that my eyesight wasn't good enough, I was in tears. And I remember calling my father from one of the red telephone boxes and said, "Dad, I can't be a pilot." And he was remarkably sanguine about it. He just said, "Well, Michael, you're good at many things." He said, "Just focus on what you do well, and it may be something will work out." And you can't imagine how, in the end, he was absolutely right.
But is that what you wanted to hear at the time or not?
No, of course not. No.
Okay. So you come to Queen's. Now, there's a famous story. You tell me if it's true. Your matriculation dinner. You're sitting next to a fellow who asks you, "What do you want to be doing?" And you said, "Go to Mars." And that person left with the impression that you were going to work in a chocolate factory. Do you remember that dinner at all or not?
I honestly don't. No, I've had a number of conversations like that. Most often, though, and this is a little bit disappointing, I would tell people what I wanted to do, and they would laugh. So I actually slowed down.
But why Mars? Why not the moon? Why?
Because people have been to the moon. I don't want to sound like Barack Obama. but well, yes, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that the future was much closer at the age of 20 here, coming, not 18, whatever, coming to Queen's.
What other first impressions do you remember from Queen's?
Well, actually, it was a bit of a grim one. When I came here to interview, it was in the rain. I don't think some of the members, none of the members here were on the, who weren't the ones who interviewed me, but I was very, very overwhelmed by the interview process. I remember the rain, walking. I think I had to take a taxi from the station to get here. And in the, in the Essex building, I walked up there, and a couple of characters who are not here today said, "Well, you're from a boarding school. Why do you think you're privileged?" And I was really taken aback by that question. And I said, "No, I don't think I'm privileged. I mean, I'm privileged to have my parents, but I don't think I'm special, so special that I should just be accepted over anybody else into Queen's College." And there was a pause. And they said, "Well, that's good." They said, "With your A-levels, you're not going to get in." And they were brutal. I had an A and 2 Bs. An A in I think it was physics. And then the 2 Bs were in chemistry and maths. And I said, "Yes, I realize that." But I was very lucky, privileged, and fortunate to take the entrance exams. And managed to get an exhibition here. So it all worked out in the end, but I didn't think I was coming to Queen's that day.
So, by the way...
But I loved the bridge. I thought it was great, even in the rain.
I remember my interview, and the person who interviewed me is sitting right there.
Oh, well, you're...
Okay, but I won't tell you
You're going to have to be way more reticent than I am.
I'll tell you
in what I said.
So, the chatter is, by your third year, you were such a sponge for knowledge that you would knock on people's doors and ask questions from supervisors, including those who weren't actually supervising you. Is that correct?
Probably, yeah.
And you didn't have any inhibition about going and knocking on someone's door and
saying,
explain this to me?
I've not had that inhibition, no.
And what reaction did you get?
Respect and in a straightforward, a desire to answer my question. It was very, very helpful. And so that's where my confidence was built up, because people took me in a very straightforward way and respected me and answered my questions. And in fact, that's the general experience I think you find you have, especially here in Cambridge.
Okay, then you go on to do a PhD. How was that?
Well, so the PhD was, I figured, possibly, was a ticket to being an astronaut. Because but actually I didn't know so I had my hopes dashed. I couldn't be a pilot astronaut. And I didn't do all that well in my first 2 years. I was getting 2 2s. And then in the third year, I really was enjoying physics. I was doing what my father said, which was experimental physics. And I thought, well, I'd either would like to be a geologist and go out and be outdoors and doing things actively, or a physicist, and I'd done some experiments out at the Mullard Radio Observatory as part of the Part 2 physics. So then I decided I just wanted to do a PhD, but I knew to do that you have to get a first-class degree. And based, again, on my records, they weren't good enough. But there's good and bad in this, but the great thing about my year at that time in Cambridge was that you could just pull it all out in your final year and get a first, and everybody forgot about the history. So I ended up with a PhD place.
So in our days, we would walk down to the Senate House, remember?
Yes.
And we would look, there would be a list, and you would be there with all your friends.
Yeah, it was quite
Do you
scary.
remember that moment?
I do, yes. But someone leaked it to me. We were in the Grove here at a cocktail party. You should always pay attention to the signals you get from your supervisors, and also other miscellaneous dons who might or might not know something about you. Because, yes, I got a feeling that I had done well, and it was before I went down to the Senate House. He didn't tell me, and I won't again say who it was, but I got a feling it was good.
And did you call your dad then?
Of course, yes. Yeah, it was very exciting.
Okay, then you start your life as an astronaut. First of all, why does it cost £100 million to train one of you? £100 million? Seriously?
It might be more.
Why?
You have to make
I mean,
sure.
you're worth it, but why?
What's the point? Is there value for money? There's a short answer, I guess, and that is there's an awful lot to tell you, and they have to do it with very expensive equipment, and they have to simulate the environment that you're going into, which is a space environment, vacuum, no weightless room. So all of that's rather hard, and so the answer is the specificity, the uniqueness of our training requires very expensive infrastructure to teach us. So when you accuse me of costing £100 million to be trained, it's not all going into the teacher's pockets, around me. It's going into the whole building.
Okay, but you didn't actually go into NASA as an astronaut. You didn't have that jacket. You were not.
Well, actually, Mohammed, you've missed out one step. So So it was the second year of the PhD when I saw an announcement from NASA that they were taking scientist astronauts. And the light bulb went on. Oh, I better finish this PhD quickly. Because I felt there was an emergency on now for me to apply to the next selection, which was going to be in 1981 or 2.
So it wasn't every year?
No, it was like every 3 or 4. And there had been a big hiatus up to that point. And the European Space Agency, and some of the people in the audience may know, have just announced an application process. And they've had, I think, 22,000 applicants just recently. So anyway, they were doing the same thing at that time, and I was trying to consider, should I apply to the ESA or should I apply to NASA? ESA had required the PhD now, whereas NASA said just 3 years of postgraduate experience by the time you get to us for the interview. So.
And you had the privilege of applying to both because?
Because of Mum. My mum was the American passport holder, and my dad was the British one.
Okay, so you applied there as a scientist.
Correct. Yes.
Your first impressions when you get there?
Well, so then so in the penultimate year of my PhD, I paid. This is where the reasons of knocking on the doors, not being afraid to ask people questions. I decided, well, actually, so I had my first business was called Cam Puntian, and I was the Commodore of Punts here at Queen's. It was a good title, best title I've had. And somehow or other, the college allowed me to use the punts in the summer to do the chauffeur punt that you all now see telling lies about the Essex building. So, and it was there I was punting a gentleman, his family, from the United States. And he happened to be from the Johnson Space Center. And he said, what do you want to be? Or what are you going to do after your degree's finished? And I said, well, I want to be an astronaut. And then he told me that he was the manager of the space shuttle program.
That's an incredible coincidence.
Yeah, and so he said, well, if you'd like, why don't you come and visit me in Houston one day? One day, far in the distant future. Well, I had tickets the next year, and I showed up. And that was my almost... Anyway, he got me interviews there, and when I showed up...
Were the interviews as tough as your Queen's interviews, or not?
Nothing light. No, Queen's was the hardest ever. No, I'm serious, hardest ever. I'm sure it's easier now, right? But anyway, I showed up, and of course, what happened was that the government, it was Ronald Reagan's term at that time, and they had a hiring freeze all of a sudden, so NASA couldn't hire. They delayed the astronaut selection. So all of the work I'd done here, turning my gliding license into a power license for aircraft, rushing through the PhD, probably not doing a very good job of it, submitting it, and then leaving quickly in a hurry. Then I arrive at NASA, and they say, sorry, no selection. And we're not hiring any government employees either. So I couldn't work for NASA, even as a payloads officer, which is what I became. So I worked for the McDonnell Douglas Corporation, which is part of Boeing now. And then it was about a year and a half later that they opened up the doors to hire government employees. So then I went and worked at the Mission Control Center.
And the people at McDonnell Douglas said, good luck.
They were, it's amazing, yeah. I thought I should be secretive about my secret hopes to become an astronaut. But I was pretty honest right up front that I wanted to be an astronaut. They never thought it would happen, you see.
So you see the theme of perseverance?
Yes, it is perseverance. I do recognize it, yes. Yeah.
Okay, and then you applied 3 times to become an astronaut, right?
So yeah, so the first time, I was amazed, really, now in hindsight. I was 24 or 25, and they had a selection. I was brought into that first class of 100 out of a 3,000, because it was all paper applications, no online. And I was privileged to even be in the 100, and I was politely told, no, you didn't make it, after the week of tests and all the rest. And then the second time, by that time I was working as a payloads officer on cargo that goes in the space shuttle, and I didn't make it that time. And then the third time I did.
And then that's it? I mean, this was the dream, or there was still a lot more in your mind? You still wanted to get to Mars at that point?
Oh, absolutely. But by this time I'm 30 years old, I'm a bit wiser about politics and the world and all the rest. So I recognize now that, in fact, when I was selected, it was after the Challenger accident. This is the first space shuttle that blew up, and it blew up in 1986 in January. And it was a very, very awful moment for the whole country. And then Ronald Reagan the president came to the Johnson Space Center and stood on a little mound there and told us how we just had to persevere, pick ourselves up, build another space shuttle and carry on the space program. But I realized by this time we were not going to the moon anytime soon. And Mars was probably, he did talk about Mars in one of his speeches, but it was probably going to be about now that we got there. So I suddenly thought, oh, this is slowing down I have a timeline, you know. I was already about 10 years behind on the selection to be an astronaut.
Have you ever thought about the notion of a station in space?
At that point, no. There was talk of a space station, but the space shuttle really was such a complete unit. It could carry a whole laboratory in it. And that's what the European Space Agency was selecting astronauts for, was flying this space station. So I sort of, my dreams of going to the moon and Mars was sort of slowly fading. But I did have one dream. May I talk about it?
Sure.
So at the end of every astronaut selection interview, they know that you've put your whole heart and soul into this application. And they're genuinely worried about your mental health if you're told that you're not going to make it. And so they ask you the question, and I really approve of this for any interview committee, is what will you do if you can't be an astronaut? And my answer in the previous ones was just try again, you know. I think it's human destiny. And you have to write an essay, a 2,000-word essay on why you want to be an astronaut. I talked about human destiny and, you know, it will ensure the survival of the species, and there should be a big industrial enterprise in the asteroid belt and all these other ideas. But on the third try, I just said, because it was after the Challenger accident, I said, look, you know, I know space is really hard. We've had the accident. We've lost 7 people. And what I really appreciate about being at NASA is just being part of this team where you work together to do something that's difficult and hard and obviously sometimes fatal. And then they say, well, what will you do if you're not going to be an astronaut? And I said, I am going to get married. And they said, who to? I said, well, Rhonda. And they were kind of interested finally at that. Because this is the third interview. They know me quite well. And then they said, well, what will you do after the congratulations? And I said, well, then I'm going to leave. And there was an opportunity to earn quite a lot of money, about $500,000, I thought, over about 3 years, tax-free, doing a kind of a missile tracking job in the Pacific Ocean. And because that was big at the time, missiles. And I'll take that money, invest it, and build my own space company and launch myself into space. And they went, oh, I guess it's time for lunch, or something like that.
So did Elon Musk talk to you at any stage?
So that's it. So I really admire Elon Musk. He did what I should have done.
You can still do it.
No.
Okay, so when I was growing up, the notion of the Soviets and the Americans coming together and collaborating in space was unthinkable. Absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah.
Okay, it was competition, 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 okay, and if you don't win, you get destroyed.
Right.
Tell us what happened.
Well, in 1975, I had left boarding school and I took that entrance exam, and I couldn't join Queen's until the following, October. So I worked in Scotland as a labourer, and during that time, the first cooperative enterprise between the United States and the Soviet Union took place, and I was oblivious to it because I was just a labourer in Scotland. But I learned later that was a big event, and it was the last use of Apollo spacecraft, and the Russians still used their Soyuz spacecraft, which I flew on later on. That was significant, but it all faded away again back into a Cold War. And then we went into this period in the 1980s where we had this Star Wars going on, and both sides were doing it. I learned later on that the Russians were doing it just like the Americans were. And it was a real Cold War. I think that's what bankrupted the Soviet Union. The United States basically won that economic arms race. And then we went right back to sort of basically another Cold War that continued after that. But there was some hope because of the fall apart of the Soviet Union. Not the Russians didn't think so great. Didn't think that was great at all. It's called Raspad Sovietskого Soyuza. But the US military kind of sat back on their laurels. And my colleagues, who are mostly, I should say, when we do a selection now, 50-50 are men and women, but there was about 3/4 were military in my selection group. They had no interest in working with the former Soviet Union cosmonauts. So when we were told by the government of the United States that we needed to fly Russians on the shuttle and we were going to go to Russia, there was a lot of antipathy, and people were very angry about that. And so that's when we were being told, because of a lack of money basically to build the Freedom Station that the US wanted to build, the all-American Freedom Station. The Congress was having trouble coming up with money, and because President Clinton was trying to solve the problem of Russian scientists not being employed and possibly going to Iran and North Korea and other countries, he, I think, along with others, decided that they could solve two problems possibly by asking Russia to be the core part of the International Space Station.
And you raised your hand saying, I'll go to Moscow for 2 years?
No, I didn't do that at all. So going back to your question, my father was a Royal Air Force pilot. He carried nuclear weapons aimed at the Soviet Union. We were based in Cyprus sometimes when I was even smaller than 6 years old. And all my colleagues, the military colleagues, thought, this is ridiculous. We're working with the enemy. Why would we do that? But we were told to do it. And I had a fantastically interesting mission on the shuttle when I was on my third space flight, did my first spacewalk. And we were told just at the last 3 months, oh, more training, more $100 million. You're going to go and fly up to the Russian Mir space station to see if it can be done as a precursor to follow-on missions that would actually put astronauts on the station, onto the Mir station. And I said, that's great, that's cool, and we're going to carry a Russian cosmonaut as well, Vladimir Titov. And we asked if he would speak English, and they said, no, probably not. But and we didn't speak any Russian, so we weren't quite sure how this was going to go. But with excitement, we did fly up to that station. And then when we came back...
How did you communicate?
Very good question. How did we communicate? And so Vladimir could speak Russian, yes, so that was a good thing. But how does he get across the space, the 10 meters of vacuum, with secure radio communications on the shuttle side? We used a ham radio, a VHF radio. It was incredibly exciting. It was just amazing. One of the most amazing moments in my life was seeing that mirror getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're in the shuttle going up to it, and the Earth's all there, and the sun's behind it. Brilliant.
Okay, then you decided to go to Moscow. When did you go?
So after that mission, which I thought was in my past now, I was going to possibly fly in space one more time, but I was assigned to design new space suits that would be for going to the moon, actually. And I was the manager. I was giving they were teaching me to be a manager, manage money. And I thought everything was just going swimmingly in my career at this point, but not going to moon or Mars. And we were doing a PR in Moscow, and they say to me, "Ah, Dr. Foale, so nice to meet you." And I go, I didn't even know how to say nice to meet you. And they said, "Isn't it wonderful that you and your family are going to be living here in Moscow at Star City in, I think it was 6 weeks' time or something, for a year and a half?" I had no knowledge. So yeah, I didn't sign up. I didn't. I was told.
So how did you tell the family?
I said, "I need to sit down." We didn't have, mobile phones, so I picked up the phone. And it was a tiny group in Star City that were interfacing with Russians to get astronauts onto the Mir station. And I called, and Rhonda was amazingly, brilliantly understanding. She was a geologist, then she became a trainer of astronauts. That's why it's 100 million, it was her. But she helped teach astronauts how to move payloads around with the shuttle arm, robotics. And she had a job. We had our first child, Jenna, who I hope she submitted her PhD today. And
that doesn't look like a convincing yes.
Poor thing, she's been dying. Anyway, Rhonda agreed to bring the family to, because I don't think it's right that you just tell your wife to pack up and move. That's not right. So I had to ask her and say, "Does this fit our plans?" But I was sort of being told. I could have turned it down. So I had to ask her, and it worked out. And so Jenna grew up there. She went, not grew up, but she went to the kindergarten, Детский сад. Our son Ian, who was about, tiny, he would just jump out the door and disappear in the snow. It's so deep.
So I want to get to your question. So I'm going to fast forward so that you can give people a preview of a movie, of a film that's going to come out, isn't it?
Oh, no.
No, not there. No. We're talking about something we're going to see in the cinema. What happened on Mir?
So Mir means peace, and not tranquility, though. And it also means the world. It means the village in Russian. And on Mir, I was expected to be there doing just science experiments, which in the end, on my 4th mission, delivered by the space shuttle, that would be great. But, and for the first 5 weeks or so, I just practiced my Russian with my crew, because they didn't speak any English. I got to know them, because I hadn't trained with them. And everything was kind of going well, until one day, Vasily was the commander, and he was a military pilot in the Soviet Air Force. So I was setting up this TV screen. I don't know what you're going to show, but if it's from...
No, I'm not going to show anything. I'm just telling them there's a possibility of a movie coming out, according to the newspapers.
Oh, well, then I better stop, because the director won't want me to finish. So anyway, it's about a collision in space. And Vasily set up a TV monitor to control the Progress cargo ship that normally brings up our fruit and vegetables and new experiments and water and oxygen. We had packed it. I'd helped do that, but I was basically the guest astronaut. Packed it with trash that was going to be deorbited into the Pacific Ocean. But about 3 days later, they turned it around, and they set up this TV system to fly it by remote control. And I came in, I floated in, and I said, and I was always asking questions, and so I had this nickname. Vasily would call me either Langley, he'd go, Langley, or, because that's where the CIA are, or Cambridge. It was great how he said Cambridge. I tell him, but the spies were for you. At Cambridge. Anyway, whatever. So he didn't seem to understand. And then this day, he's all dressed up and he's got the TV on, and I said, "Can I help?" And then Sasha, the flight engineer, he's the civilian, also in the Communist Party. I said, Sasha, what are you doing? He says, "Well, you don't need to know." And I said, "Well, I've done rendezvous in a space shuttle up to the Mir on the previous flight. I know about this stuff." I said, how can I help? He said, no, you don't need to. And then I said, well, how are you going to measure? I was just curious. I was asking too many questions. I said, how are you going to measure the speed and the distance? Because I was really curious why they had the TV up. Normally they have a radar that measures the speed and the distance. They said, we're turning the radar off. I said, why? They said, we don't know. And they didn't know. I said, but we're turning the radar off. The short answer is someone wanted to not pay for the radar that was being built in the Ukraine for $2 million a rocket, and they didn't want to buy it. And so some manager in Moscow said, let's have the crew try and do it without the radar. That way we won't have to buy the radar each time, and I can build a dacha. It's not, yes, it really is how it goes. And so I said, no, but why? But how are you going to measure the speed and the distance? So we're going to look at how big the mirror is in the screen, count the squares, because you're looking at the mirror, us, from this remote vehicle coming in with a TV camera, and you're seeing how big we look in the screen. And the bigger we get, obviously, the closer we are in the screen. He said, we're going to count how many squares the solar arrays fill in the screen. We're going to write that down, go to the graph paper, find out what the distance is, write that down, and then we're going to do it again a minute later, divide it by the time, and we'll get the speed. And I said, well, you're going to get behind, we cover this expression in flying, behind the power curve. You're going to be behind in the calculation process. You won't have an up-to-date speed so that you know what to do to slow down. Because the whole point is that you come in fast because in orbital mechanics, you have to go fast if you want to have a straightish line. If you go slowly, you end up doing these curves because of the Coriolis force. So anyway, I said, so how can I help? Can I go and take a laser ranger to the back end of the vehicle to see and tell you? You can cheat, I basically was saying. I can give you the speed and the range using the laser if you give me a headset and I'll go to the back. And they had a laser there, and I said, you know, I know how that works. They said, no, you can't. It's a military laser. And I said, but we had one on the space shuttle, just like that. So anyway, I went to the back, couldn't find the mirror, the progress, and came back. And as I came back, by this time it was so close and going so fast and in the wrong direction that Sasha says to me, Michael, vkrabel, and which means go to the spacecraft, which is our lifeboat. And I go, okay, and at that point, as I'm floating through into the lifeboat, the Soyuz, I see the whole station kind of shudder around me. There's a kind of a crunch noise, and then a bit later, a couple of seconds later, I really think maybe that's the moment of death. So I start to think about breathing out so I don't get the embolism, which is ridiculous when you think about it. But that's what divers do. If you think you're about to have a rapid decompression, you breathe out. Because there's going to be no air left afterwards. But that's what I thought. And then as another couple of seconds went by, I thought, no, it's not happening, which is good. You know, things are looking up. And then I felt my ears popping. So I thought, oh, no, it's not so good. And then their sirens started going off. And from that point onwards, it became a survival situation to stop the air leaving.
How much did you know about the extent of damage, about oxygen, about everything? How much information did you actually have?
Almost none. So yes, we do spend all this money on training, and there were procedures, and the Russians did the same thing. And the procedure said we had been trained in a vacuum chamber on Earth, in Star City, to go immediately, all of us, to the spacecraft and close the hatch there so that we knew the spacecraft was good enough to come home in. It's a lifeboat. And make sure the leak's not there. So I was waiting for them, and I watched them, and I'd gotten it. There was a thing in the way of the hatch, so I'd taken that out of the way, and I watched them, and they weren't moving. They weren't coming. And Vasily, by this time, was being spoken to by Mission Control Moscow, because the collision happened when it was out of communication. And they told him to stay. Well, they didn't give him any option to go and check the spacecraft. They just held him in place and said, tell us the pressure, tell us the pressure. And it was falling. And I didn't know what was being said. Sasha and I now were trying to, again, so I said to Sasha, I didn't say anything to Sasha initially. I just thought, well, I've fixed up the Soyuz, we're ready to go. But these guys aren't coming. And I'm just waiting for them to do the procedure, but they're not. Sasha's now working to get cables out of the way of the Spectre module, which is where I'd been living, which had been hit, by the way. And we have these 18 thick cables in the way of the hatch being closed. And so he's not coming. I'm thinking, all right, if we pass out, because I don't know what the oxygen pressure is, I just know my ears are popping. I just think, I'm younger than they are. They will pass out before I do, because I know at least one of them smokes. Not on the So I start washing my fingernails to see how blue they go. While I see, and I thought, well, I better help Sasha. So I'm helping Sasha get these cables out. I'm washing my fingers. And at some point, Vasily floats over us and goes and gets a couple of oxygen bottles, and he's putting the oxygen into the cabin, and it's really noisy now. And then the sirens are going off on and off. And then at some point, I think maybe 6 minutes after the collision, I say to Sasha, why are we doing this? How do you know the leak's there? And he says, I can hear it hissing. I go, okay, all right. There's a leak there. Because I couldn't hear it, because I was in the Soyuz, and he's around, he's where you are, and I'm there. So anyway, I keep pulling the cables out. And then we try and put this hatch in place that had been tied off 13 years ago. And we had to go and find a knife and start cutting it, put it in. Anyway, it finally sucks in. And at that point, the leak stops. But what we've done is we've disconnected all of the power cables that power the mirror. So now the mirror, because ridiculously this module was added much later on in the design process, so they didn't plan for the electric cables to be on the outside in the vacuum. They put them through the passageway where the hatch closes. So that's why we couldn't close the hatch initially. So now that we've disconnected all the cables so that we can close the hatch, we've now disconnected all the power to the mirror station. So we suddenly all of the lights go off, all the fans go off. No airflow.
What are you thinking at that point?
Well, I'm thinking, well, it was good. It was quite good for a while, and then I just knew that we were in for a long, long struggle, and for another maybe an hour and a half. So now we've gone into darkness. We go around the Earth every 90 minutes, and darkness lasts about 30 minutes. We go into darkness. Vasily is in terrible psychological shape because he feels he's lost the Soviet Union's space gem, because he was at the controls when this happened. And we're in total silence, and we have no lights, there's no sound. We don't have LED lights, we have the flashlights, torches that use the incandescent bulbs, and they go out. We know they burn out very quickly. So he said, no, we can't use any torches. So we go by this big window where the starlight is. Then we've got Aurora below us. We're going over, I think, probably Canada or something like that, maybe Antarctica. And it's just, it's just utterly gorgeous out the window. And I don't know what to say, but I think, we're in such bad shape psychologically. Someone needs to say something. So I thought, okay, I know it's been a terrible day, but isn't this a beautiful sight? And Vasily just says, it's been a terrible day. And then we just carry on waving paper in front of our face to keep the carbon dioxide from building up around us. Anyway, long story short, we have to somehow get this space station alive. So I said to them, I remember Vasily Titov on my previous flight had talked about a story where he'd gone to the Mir in the early days and he'd been able to move it around using a Soyuz. So I said, can we use the Soyuz and turn it on and fire the jets independently so that we can stop the Mir tumbling? Because the Mir's tumbling for a complicated, you're good technical people here. So there's all these gyroscopes that are spinning and they are rigid inertially in space. And so that's how the Mir stays stable. But once the power's been cut, all these gyroscopes, and there were 12 of them, they've all spanning at 20,000 RPMs and they're 1.5 kilos of gold each. They start spinning down and all that in momentum, angular momentum starts going into the Mir and it starts wobbling and turning and moving around. So the solar rays can't possibly point to the sun. They can't track fast enough and they only have one axis to rotate anyway. So there was no way the Mir would get power back unless we did something to make that spinning or tumbling either stop or be stable. And so this is where the Cambridge physics education comes in. I wasn't great at rotational dynamics here, I got to say, but I learned it later on. Anyway, I started proposing that we use the Soyuz to spin it about one axis first to try and get rid of a rotation, and then spin it about another axis to build up a rotation. And we ended up succeeding. And that's the long story.
And
short.
they're listening to you at this
and
point.
They did, but convincing a Soviet commander who has been told that the American is most likely a spy and definitely a guest and hasn't been trained on the Russian things is really, really risky. It's a terribly risky thing for them to do, to listen to me, because I don't know. But I laid out the alternatives, which was we just get colder and colder. We could feel the station getting really, really cold. And at some point we either die here or try and leave in the Soyuz. And at some point, if we're spinning too much, the Soyuz can't leave. So eventually, we had a model of the Mir, and I'd take a torch, literally, and shine it and say, this is the sun, we need to stop these tumblings. And I'd go to Windows, and you'd measure how fast we were rotating. We were only rotating about 2 or 3 degrees a second, but it was a lot. That's a lot for a space station to be spinning. And the solar rays can't track. So I proposed doing it. They said no. Vasily said, no, it'll use up fuel out of the Soyuz, which we need to go home. And then I'd ask him, well, how much fuel will you use if you do a pulse? You can't know that, you're a spy. I said, how many kilos were you? How much kilo? So none of these numbers I'd been given. I learned them much later on when I flew on the Soyuz as an engineer. But none of those numbers I knew. And then I said, well, what else are we going to do? And that was the moment. And I started working on, so if your commander won't agree, you start working on your other teammates. And I started working on Sasha, who's the engineer. And I said, Sasha, what do you think? Can we turn on the Soyuz and fire the jets individually? And he kind of paused and then said, well, yes, I think we could. So then Vasily, because Sasha agreed, he goes to the Soyuz, tries to turn it on, and it won't turn on. And that's because the Mir is dead. And the Mir power is required to disconnect the Soyuz from the Mir. But the Mir has no power, That is a catch-22. But about another orbit later, we wobbled into sunlight, had enough power so that we heard the fans come up, and it only lasted 5 minutes, but Vasily floated quickly to the Soyuz and flipped the switch to get it off of the Mir power bus. And then he was able to turn it on its batteries. And then he went through a sequence of trial and error experiments to see if he can fire the jets of the Soyuz. Initially, it didn't work because the Soyuz thought it was free in space, which is normal for the Soyuz. And then it felt this Mir thing attached to it and started firing all of its fuel and jets to try and stop this rotation, which it didn't understand because the computer was very simple. But we eventually got to a mode, I don't think we could ever have done this with the space shuttle, but because the Russians always build up in stages of reliability, so they still had the ancient fire one by one method, still built into the Soyuz system. They were able to down mode to that and then start firing the jets individually to stop our rotation.
That's an incredible story. And the way you behaved and kept it together and everything else, that's incredibly inspirational. Okay, I want to get to your questions. As you prepare your questions, 4 rapid fire, so very short answers, okay?
Yes.
Your favorite space movie?
Interstellar. And actually, or The Martian. I like The Martian a lot. I have to say The Martian, but Interstellar was a very good one.
I would have guessed Apollo 13. Within what time period will a human be born on another planet?
I think after 2050, but before 2100. 2100, yeah.
Okay, last question. The probability of life elsewhere?
Oh, 1.
And
it's 0.999, but 999 recurring. Oh, how about that? That's a good answer, isn't it?
When did we discover it?
Huh?
When did we discover life?
When will we?
Yeah.
Well, there'll always be an argument. It's a bit like people denying that we landed on the moon or that the world's round, Well, there'll always be a denier. But I think we will have a general consensus that we found life probably after 2050 and before 2100. And that's based on the exoplanet research that's going on now. It's really, really cool stuff.
So, questions to Mike. Just tell us who you are.
Can you also say if you're a student or a faculty, or because that makes me feel good when you say you're a student.
Go ahead, up there first.
Hi, I'm Mohamed El-Erian as a student.
Good.
I'm doing a master's in physics. My question to you is about the future. What do you think the future of space exploration is with now the privatization of exploration, things like Tesla and NASA competing for funds? Do you think we're going to see people go more and more towards privatized or class-based kind of space exploration?
I think
And Michael, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question because we've got people who are
So the question is, what's
online.
the future based on the fact that there's a tension between commercial space and government space? And and you mentioned specifically SpaceX and Elon Musk's company. So I think all of that is very, very good. I think the commercial rockets are just an opportunity for NASA to spend its government money on a bigger rocket, and maybe not bigger, just a different rocket that allows them to put the first woman on the moon. And that's called the Artemis program. The date still for landing the first woman on the moon is 2024. I think it's going to slip a year or two. But that's the goal for NASA, is to put the first woman on the moon in 2024. And she will probably have other colleagues with her. That will be done with government money, but all the rest of it will be done with Elon Musk-type vehicles. In fact, Elon Musk has a contract right now to build the lunar lander to go to the moon's surface. Another 10 years, 20 years beyond that, I think Elon Musk's enthusiasm to go to Mars will be sustained, and there will be talk of an expedition to Mars. But most likely it will start on Phobos. It will be a joint commercial government project, probably international at that, because it's so expensive. And commercial will have the option to put people on, rather like recently Elon Musk launched an entirely commercial crew that paid their ticket money, independent of the government programs. So I think the two are going to go together, and I think it's very exciting. And I think it will open up the opportunity for many more people to go into space.
There was another one.
Yes?
I'm a student. I'm just wondering about your motivation in your work, and when there was kind of the recent, Elon Musk kind of competition, there was a lot of criticism about their kind of justification. Do you think that for you is kind of an industrial justification, or is it just that going to space is kind of a human endeavor that we should encourage?
It's the second. I think, so the question was, should commercial kind of take away seats or affect the seats of government astronauts? It's kind of the way astronauts saw that. They saw it as kind of an either or. I really think it expands the ability for everybody. And they also are able to fly more people. So when after the last shuttle accident, we had to ground the shuttle. We were flying 7 people at a time. So that was a lot of people flying into space. I flew so many times, 6 times into space, partly because I was so lucky to be an astronaut while the shuttle still hadn't had enough accidents to be grounded. That's basically the luck I had. And then we went to the Soyuz just as the only way of getting to the space station. That was only 3 people at a time, and we only launched that 4 times a year. So it was a very limited number of people from the whole planet to go into space. Now that Elon Musk and possibly, there's another vehicle made by Boeing called Starliner, and that really should start flying this year or next, carrying up to 7 people. And the same for Elon Musk's vehicle, carry up to 7, although they aren't doing that because they put cargo on as well. So that's going to increase the number of flights. I think I lost the train of your question there, sorry.
Is it really a human endeavor?
It is a human endeavor, yeah. That's why I care about it, and I assume why most people here care about it. Politicians, yeah, they get the Cold War thing and they want to project power. But projecting power, it's still going on. Obviously, other nations, good nations, when I say good, technological nations like China and India can launch into space, have their human space program. There are 3 Chinese people on the space station, on their Chinese space station, and 1 woman right now. And they're not spoken about much at NASA, but that's the fact. And India will be launching, I think, in a year or so, 3 people too.
Other questions? Let's go here on the side.
Hi, I'm Marcus, PhD student. I was wondering, do you know of any projects at NASA or the European Space Agency that seek to address Kessler syndrome?
I don't know what that syndrome is.
So Kessler syndrome is, because of past exploration projects, we have lots of space debris. And so we have low orbit space debris and then geosynchronous where it's further out. And as these objects crash into one another, they create smaller pieces.
Yeah. So the question's about space debris, and of course rockets that don't make it, but they get out of they get it into orbit, but they don't get to their destination orbit. Rockets that blow up halfway, they put space debris out, and these projectiles, especially in low Earth orbit, can remain for tens of years, decades. And if it's up as high as 800 kilometers or so, they'll last thousands of years. And it's a problem. It's a very significant problem to space endeavors. And the reason why we think the space station, International Space Station, has a lifetime is because we're based on that cloud of debris. We think there's going to be a leak caused by the debris that will give it a lifetime of no more than about 30 years. In fact, when we fly around the International Space Station, leaving in the shuttle, we can see holes in the solar arrays already, fist-sized holes. And one time when I was looking out the window, a mirror, one hit the window while I was looking out. So it is a problem. I don't know it's going to stop anything because there's two good things happening. One is the solar maximum comes and goes every 11 years, and that lifts the atmosphere up, the ionosphere up, and that increases drag, and these items, in the lower orbits anyway, tend to spiral out. So that's one cleaning action caused by the sun's cycle. The other one is spacecraft are now being developed. One of them is Surrey Satellite in the UK. They're developing a kind of a parasol-like thing or it's like a net, I think if I remember it right, and it kind of it flies up to debris and kind of catches it.
Great question. Other questions? Any?
Yes,
over here,
ma'am.
Here on the left. Okay.
In terms of carbon neutral and environmental effects of spaceflight, spaceflight is so uncommon at the moment. We can't, it's a tiny fraction of the CO2 problem that we have. Our industry, our coal plants, etc., and our flying jet aircraft, those are the cause of our CO2 problem. Should we redirect the money that we put into space development to Earth? That was a question that was maybe appropriate 20, 30 years ago when all of the outlay into space was being directed by government budgets. But now it's not. Now it's commercial enterprises. So you're going to have to convince every person who wants to do a space business not to do it. And they're doing it because they're not going to make money in space. They're going to make money on Earth. They want to spend the money on Earth. There will be no one buying the services that they produce anywhere else but on Earth. Not quite. Some of the things landing on the moon in the next 10 years or so, they will be using services provided around the moon. But again, the money's all being exchanged on Earth. It doesn't add significantly to carbon. And it may actually solve the carbon problems when you get into things like space-based solar power, although I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think it's much better to have solar tiles on your houses. I think that's what you should do. But there are some solutions that and then solar mirrors is another one. Sorry, orbital mirrors is another technology. But really, they are separate problems, I believe.
All the way up there.
Hi, yeah, student portrait, please. I wondered if you have any idea, what's your opinion on when NASA and ESA will ever work with the Chinese space agency?
Oh, gosh. Thank you for your question. When will NASA and ESA work with the Chinese Space Agency? Well, I'll tell you a secret, because obviously people don't know this. ESA is already working with the Chinese Space Agency, and in fact, I think I know that there's a couple of astronauts there in China right now, European ones, training. So that's in the cards. Why NASA won't? That is all to do with parochial, senatorial politics in the United States. There are a couple of senators who have focused on the human rights abuses of the Chinese and have never allowed for any other dialogue except we will only focus on those. So they have forbidden NASA by law from ever working with China, which is why, yes, absolutely, anyone who's smart would say you should put the Chinese into the International Space Station program because they're another vehicle, they're another way to get there. And anyway, we work with another former enemy, Russia, in space just fine. So I personally think there should be a parallel path. You address your issues with a country in one dialogue, but you can also cooperate with them in another. And then sadly, we can't do that at NASA because of one of these laws.
Can I come to a fellow, Chris?
Thank you very much. Chris Beñasco, fellow in economics. It's kind of a follow-up So the IEA, the International Space Station, is the shared effort and collaboration of several superpowers. Given the change in the geopolitical situation that the world has experienced within the last 20 years, do you conceive that it would be possible to launch a project similar like this in the current world we are living in? And given the lack of agreement that we are seeing among superpowers in many other pressing issues, what can we learn from initiatives like this of collaboration and cooperation that could be applied to other fields?
So I think the pessimistic way for me to understand your question is, could we ever do something like the International Space Station again? And that implies, and I totally agree, that the International Space Station is one of the greatest cooperative endeavors ever accomplished, not attempted, accomplished by humanity. It probably does cost $150 billion overall if you add up all of the contributions. But it involves 17 or 18 different partner nations. It is a tremendous achievement, and including former enemies and people. So for that reason, we can take pride in it as humans. I don't know that the situation was any worse when President Clinton decided, no, we're not going to do the Freedom Station. We're going to bring in this former enemy and partner with them and build the International Space Station. That was a pretty difficult moment and a pretty difficult decision for him to make, along with President Yeltsin, of course. It's two-sided. And so I believe, as an optimist, I cannot prove it, that we will do that again. And I hope we will. I also imagine that 100 years from now, when we actually have people living on Mars, and we have people living on the Moon, and we have people working in the asteroid belt, there'll be a federation of planets that can cooperate and do things beyond the solar system.
One last question from Mr.
You're more pessimistic, and I understand your pessimism.
You get the last question.
So I'm an undergrad student in engineering first year, and my question is about your involvement with Iceset and mission discovery. As someone who's been through the program, I want to know from your side, both personally and also from the perspective of the entire space industry, what's the motivation to do programs like that?
That's fantastic. I'm going to tell Chris Barber.
Repeat the question, though.
Yeah, sorry. He's just puffed me up. So the question was, what's my association with this group called the International Space School Education Trust, called Iceset? And I am here, actually on Sunday, I go to Newcastle, and we will bring in 150 A-level kids or lower, at this lower age, to learn about space from me, another astronaut, Barbara Morgan, who was the first teacher in space, and some flight controllers from NASA, and local professors from King's College London. I say local to the UK. And we're going to teach them about space and space experiments, and by the end of the week, next week in Newcastle, we will choose a team of, and they'll be in teams of maybe 10 each, these students. We'll choose the experiment they designed to go to the ISS, and we will build it and send it to the ISS. And we've sent 40 experiments now to the International Space Station in this program, and we've been doing it all over the world, in Australia, India, China, only one or two in the United States. We've done lots in the UK. Most of them have been, well, all over. But we haven't done one in Cambridge, so looking for a faculty to host Mission Discovery. I just came from Oxford yesterday, where we are actually building one of those experiments that will be launched to the ISS. So thank you for your question, and I am thrilled that you are here after going through Mission Discovery. Did it help?
Yes.
Thank you.
What's your motivation?
My motivation? Oh, okay. That's a very personal question. I get your energy. So when I talk to young people about space, maybe younger than students at Cambridge, but where I get their enthusiasm, their interest. And because I'm the one who's flown into space 6 times in more than a year, sometimes I lose appreciation of how lucky I've been, of what I've seen and done. And when I get to tell the story to the kids, I get that energy. So thank you.
So let's conclude with this. You're speaking to our students who are on the cusp of a very exciting professional journey. Some may have a vision, a passion like you had, some may not. But what do you tell people? You know, you were almost derailed several times, and somehow you found the inner strength to get back up and continue. So what do you tell our students? Because life has become hard. They've gone through a year and a half of unthinkables, and it's just the beginning of having one unanticipated shock after the other. What do you tell them?
Well, I understand even with the COVID in particular has affected people. The answer is recognize that your depression, your anger, your despondency, your disappointment is something that it's an emotion that all humans share and have, but they don't share it with you. And I think my personal way of dealing with it is get some sleep. No, I really, the first thing you need to do is go to bed and get some sleep. And in the morning, re-look at it and talk to someone about it. And then, if people don't believe your goal, and in my case that was the case, read or watch stories about it. So in my case, I read a lot of science fiction. If you have any kind of role models, go back to reading about them, because that helped me enormously.
Mike, I started with 6 words, and that was based on the research that I'd done on you, but you've demonstrated vision, perseverance, humility, agility, courage, and most importantly, an inspiration. Join me in thanking him.